Please welcome Amy Wax.
Thank you again, and I'm honored to be addressing you again here. I've really enjoyed my time up north, as they say, and I appreciate the invitation. So I am not going to use my short time here to tell the dreary tale of my cancellation, as a friend puts it, by my home institution, the University of Pennsylvania. But I am happy to answer specific questions about it if they come up, and of course I will be using some of the things that happened to me to illustrate the points that I am going to make in this talk. So I am going to address in this talk the censorship temptation. What are the principal threats to freedom of thought and expression in my country, the United States, and where do they come from? And I think this is going to be relevant to the whole Anglosphere, frankly. And why does this matter to democracy and to the American way of life? Now, no surprise, in my view, the main threat comes from this ideology and the ideas and practices it has spawned that has taken over our principal opinion-shaping institutions, the universities, the educational establishment, the media, nonprofits, journalism, and the professions, medicine and law. Quite striking that academic medicine has been completely taken over by this. You'd think it would be resistant, as well as large parts of the corporate world. All the sectors that are controlled by our elite so-called educated class. And once again, no surprise, these threats come overwhelmingly from the left, indeed the far left. Conceitedly, they are currently under political pressure from the Trump administration, but in my view, that pressure has yet to make a significant dent, and whether it will actually move the needle remains to be seen. Now, I recognize this is not the only threat. I hear constant complaining about attempts to curtail expression and academic freedom coming from the right, from Republican politicians and officials, from the deplorable public, and the like. And I do not deny that those pressures exist, but I really do not think that they are as important or consequential as the threats from the left, and especially those from the sectors that I have detailed. And the reason is simple. Overwhelmingly, the left controls these sectors to the point of virtually pushing out anyone else. And these sectors have no intention of relinquishing control or really even giving an inch, despite suggestions and hopes at a little bit of window dressing to the contrary. So that is the situation today. Now, what do I believe specifically has gone wrong in our society to lead to this situation where free thought and dissent is endangered and censorship is on the agenda? Well, first and foremost, and I've already spoken about this, we have the rise of so-called woke ideology. And we can talk about where that woke ideology comes from. There's no paucity of theories. But I want to hone in on one important aspect of wokeism, which is the demand for so-called equity, for equality of results, and the moral certainty of that demand. And I will explain that the equitable imperative and the moral certainty lead inevitably to censorship and to punishing dissenters. Second, the rise of traumatology, the tendency to psychologize, subjectivize, and thus distort, expand, and abuse the concepts of harm, our good old Millian harm, right, which now has metastasized into this monster of trauma, harassment, hostile environment, and the demand for a psychologically safe environment. All of them have become weaponized to justify censorship and the silencing of dissent. And the third culprit is feminization. Feminization of education, the universities, and other aspects of our society, which undermines tolerance for alternative viewpoints, repels debate and free inquiry, and leads to censorship of unpleasant ideas in the name of protecting vulnerable groups from the aforementioned trauma. Taking these in order, the rise of woke. We already know what woke is. It divides the world into oppressors and oppressed. It identifies Europeans, Americans, and white people and their way of life as bigoted and oppressive, with disadvantaged minorities as the victim. And woke's disdain for the West extends to contempt for free thought and speech, which are regarded as tools of white hegemony. Hence, protecting free speech and free thought is not a priority in the woke realm, far from it. In addition, as I said, woke sees all inequalities and all deviations from strict equality as illegitimate, as evil products of bigotry and discrimination, which require drastic action to vanquish. Why does this obsession with equality threaten free thought? Because insisting on strict equality of outcomes and adopting the belief that only racism stands in the way requires suppressing facts and accepting falsehoods, facts about the world and falsehoods about reality. And this leads inexorably to censorship of those who would speak of reality. Now, what do I mean? There's plenty of strong empirical evidence, historically and presently, that not all people or all groups or all cultures are the same and are equal in every respect. Incompetence, capacity, contributions, cultural habits, and outlooks. This ought to be obvious to any honest observer, yet this observation cannot be expressed in polite elite company, and certainly not on campuses in my country, as unbelievable as that is. Further, there are good reasons to deny that all inequalities are the product of bigotry or discrimination or racism. Once again, one can adduce plenty of empirical facts to back up this observation, yet woke dogma cannot accept these possibilities and is actively hostile to them. There is one and only one narrative. Admitted or even considering the realities and observations that belie the woke worldview jeopardizes woke's extravagant and ambitious social engineering projects, which is to bring about equality by any and all means necessary. Any observations that cast doubt on this priority and related ones, here we're talking about globalism, multiculturalism, and all that good stuff, are hidden, must be hidden and suppressed, and discussion is frowned on. Take as an example the current controversies surrounding student visas in the United States and the growing number of foreign students that are educated in our institutions. I recently read a remarkable student paper that laid bare the enormous size of this enterprise, its lax oversight, its myriad abuses by foreigners and universities alike, which explains how student visas in the United States are deployed to circumvent immigration restrictions and supply cheap labor through special employee sponsorship programs for foreign graduates of American universities, and here we are not talking necessarily about Yale and Harvard. And these employment programs are exempt from Social Security taxes for employers. Little known fact, which of course lowers their costs and undercuts Native workers. Once again, these facts are hidden. They are hidden by the mainstream media, which is completely complicit with these institutions and their project. This situation ought to be the subject of journalistic exposés, but it is not, at least not yet, because anyone who lays bare the truths and the critiques of this outrageous grift is sure to be labeled xenophobic, hostile to knowledge and education, anti-intellectual, or just plain racist, which is the ultimate all-purpose insult. In sum, the observations and arguments that run up against progressive priorities must be censored. They must be punished. They must be suppressed. And there are many of these. Hence, free thought and expression are antithetical to woke's ideology and its objectives. The woke ideology also leads inexorably to double standards in the treatment of ideas. The division of the world into oppressor and oppressed means that attacking or even lying about oppressors, white people, whatever, is allowed or encouraged. But criticism of the oppressed, however valid and backed by facts, is forbidden. And this attitude can be found in my own institution, Penn, which permits and has permitted open expression of pro-Hamas, pro-Palestinian, anti-Jewish, anti-Israeli opinions, but has little tolerance for any negative commentary about other groups higher up on the intersectionality hierarchy, the oppressed groups, the disadvantaged groups. Thus, based on general observations I made about women and blacks in the media, which Penn never claimed were false or inaccurate, I was accused by my institution of, quote, inequitably targeted disrespect. At the same time, negative generalizations and opinions regarding Jews were overlooked or fiercely defended or even celebrated after October 7th, while savage criticisms of Trump and Republicans continue to be unrelenting. Likewise, woke ideology's stark Manichaean division of society promotes a moral certainty that undermines tolerance for different ideas and adds to the license to suppress those ideas, which of course are regarded as evil. This attitude is a threat not only to the education system at the university, with its dedication to empirical investigation, but to democracy itself. Without tolerance for different positions and ideas, democracy cannot exist, as it does not, and frankly will never, in most of the world and in most cultures. Our insightful founder, James Madison, and I realized this very poignantly when I went back and reread the Federalist Papers. Our genius founder, James Madison, understood this in one of his most profound insights, which is worth sustained and serious contemplation. He said, and really it takes a while to understand the full implications of this, he said, free societies and democracies will always have factions. It will never go away. And our job is to construct a system and a society and to write a constitution that manages factions. What does that mean? Free people will always differ in their ideas and their priorities. They will never converge towards complete and perfect consensus. Yet many far-left woke progressives have forgotten that insight. They do believe, and I have heard them say, that we will all come to agreement and errant thoughts will be vanquished if we only are properly informed and educated. James Madison would reject this decisively. He understood that democracy demands We learn to live with the permanence of disagreement, a free democracy. Right? We must tolerate faction. We must coexist, however grudgingly, with the loyal opposition. And the concept of the loyal opposition couldn't be more important. Right? And therefore, we must restrain our impulses to destroy and persecute and decimate our opponents, which is pretty much what happens in the rest of the world. I tell my students, you know, Syria has been liberated from Assad, but it will, excuse my language, always be a shithole country because they don't get it. The next people who come into power will just turn around and kill their opponents. And that will go on and on and on. It will never end because they do not get that this is a key component of a viable democracy. Indeed, maintaining a loyal opposition is very hard to do. It's a fragile ethos that is easily lost. Once again, very rare in the outside world, but one that we rely on. So the progressive woke idea that we will all agree, we must all agree, because there is evil and there is good, and we know what the good is, and we know what the evil is, takes a wrecking ball to the delicate ecology of tolerance that our wise founders envisioned, and is therefore very dangerous. And is the enemy of free thought and expression, because it inevitably leads to punishing dissent. Madison's understanding is endangered in our society, not just from the left, from that Wilsonian progressive attitude so dominant among elites that insists that enlightenment will lead to consensus, but alas now from some elements on the right, which are tempted to use their power to indulge in punitive retaliation. The tendency to go beyond criticizing to crushing and demonizing the loyal opposition, rather than respecting, negotiating, and compromising, the refusal to deal across difference, the turning of dissenters into the enemy, rather than regarding them as fellow Americans and friends, and here I refer you to Lincoln's second inaugural, where he said, the vanquished Confederates, they are not our enemy. They are our fellow citizens. They must be our friends. So this is a concept that Lincoln articulated so well, but to reject that difficult concept is the path to toxic polarization and alienation that we are seeing in our country today. And that erosion, I thought, was highlighted by a very funny story in a recent public television documentary about LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, a tragic figure, but perhaps the most politically effective president we have ever had. In expressing his frustration about the trajectory of the Vietnam War, Johnson told an aide that he was confident that he could win over Ho Chi Minh, the North Vietnamese leader and opponent, to forge a compromise. He told the aide, I wish I could sit down with that damn sucker face to face and talk to him, deal with him. I know I can change his mind. I can offer him all these goodies, these great society programs. How could he possibly resist that? I know I could get him to give up the war. Johnson's willingness and penchant for dealing with the enemy and his confidence in the power of political give and take seem quite quaint, even touching today. Of course, but of course that's the American way. He was the quintessential political operative. A system in which enemies must work together, must talk to each other, with the goal of finding common ground they could live with, and with the hope to win another day. That is our constitutional design. That is what our founders strove for. And they were quite openly conscious of what they were trying to do. Now, the second monstrosity spawned by woke ideology is this traumatology that I referred to. The tendency to psychologize and subjectivize notions of harm, a hostile environment, perverting all these legal concepts like harassment, extending them, extrapolating them far beyond their original meaning. Courses claim that vulnerable, marginalized groups must be protected from speech, facts, and opinions that they find offensive or distressing or simply disagree with, because such speech can cause them harm in the form of mental trauma and distress. So there is this demand for safe environments, free from upsetting thoughts and ideas. This demand is extremely dangerous. It's a weaponization of the classic harm principle and of many of these legal concepts that the harm principle has spawned. And it enshrines what in First Amendment law is termed the heckler's veto. The unchecked right of those upset or offended by speech to shut it down. American courts have long understood that heckler's vetoes are effectively a method to gut free speech protections, and they are very clear on this. I commend the United States Supreme Court because they have never abandoned this idea. So disallowing the veto is a pillar of legal First Amendment jurisprudence and free speech protections. The offense or disapproval of the listener is never grounds for curtailing or punishing speech, except, of course, in your universities. And of course, the subjective nature of such claims pose a special dangers. Why? Because they are unprovable, they are unanswerable, they are impervious to rational analysis. They must be accepted once asserted by victims, who must be regarded as trustworthy, right, and good, and therefore unchallengeable. Likewise, sexual and racial harassment concepts have been taken far beyond their original framework to deplatform dissenters of all kinds. And these categories are applied even in trivial and trifling examples. There's severe bracket creep has bedeviled this area of traumatology. The abuse of these concepts, the rhetoric of safetyism, has been deployed repeatedly against me by my own university. So based on my conservative positions, publicly pronounced, students claim that they could reasonably believe that I am biased and would discriminate against them, and thus I am unfit to teach. Now, these are totally unproven assertions about students' frame of mind, about my state of mind. There's no objective evidence for this kind of assertion, but of course none is needed. They are irrefutable. That is the beauty of them. That is the trick of them. Likewise, students at my school claim that they are so traumatized by my opinions and viewpoints, once again expressed outside the classroom, in writing or in media or at conferences, that they are unable to learn from me. Once again, I am unfit to teach. How do I counter those statements? It's impossible, and it's designed to be impossible. So these accusations must be indulged, and they are indulged by our academic establishment. That is how it works. Finally, the final enemy of free thought is feminization. Feminization not just in universities, but in other spheres as well. And what do I mean by that? Feminization elevates feel-good and emotional priorities and the pursuit of personal and group equity and psychological safety over more traditionally masculine values and virtues. Equal outcomes are regarded as a higher priority than competence, excellence, and merit. The subjective well-being and self-regard of vulnerable and oppressed groups are elevated over objectivity, rigor, free inquiry, the search for truth, and the preservation of Western values and achievements. Now, there is sound empirical data supporting the charge of feminization of our universities. A psychologist previously working at Penn, now a newly appointed professor of psychology at New College in Florida, her name is Corey Clark, has confirmed that men and women in academia assign very different priorities to truth-seeking and discovering new knowledge versus shielding vulnerable victims from unfamiliar, upsetting ideas. It is the women who emphasize protection. Also, men and women differ in their willingness to suppress or deplatform speech they deem dangerous or inequitable or hurtful, with women much more willing to censor. To summarize the situation in my own words, women have been allowed to import the values of the nursery and the kindergarten into the grown-up institution of academia, and not to good effect. In addition, I believe that reordering priorities among feminized lines, coupled with other aspects of woke, has promoted a greater willingness to lie, to distort reality, to flout the truth in service of these emotional priorities, in an attempt to silence oppressors and dissidents like me. In my own case, a few students and faculty accusing me of misconduct towards them personally, as distinct from outside extramural statements, are overwhelmingly female. And I am here to assure you that those accusations play fast and loose with the truth. Some of them are merely fabrication. Others misrepresent or distort my words beyond recognition, changing their actual meaning, and even statements I have made in public, which can easily be checked and verified, are soundbited, misquoted, twisted, and ripped out of context to create alarming little tidbits that are frankly misleading. Now, why do students and others go along with this? I think that it's part of the assault on Western values that is now embedded in our education system. Young people are taught to disdain the very concept of objective truth and the obligation to tell it. That is the bourgeois virtue of honesty. This leads to a casual attitude to falsehood and distortion, and a de-emphasis on honesty, objectivity, and truth-telling, and even simple logic as central to our morality and our way of life. And it also leads, as a side effect, to the habitual abuse of language, of the failure to describe facts precisely and in neutral terms, the willingness to put words in people's mouths, to play fast and loose with the evidence, to tolerate or even embrace sins of omission and double standards in the way reality is described. Now, I can give you examples. I don't want to prolong the agony here. There are many, but one of my favorites and a routine tick of the mainstream media is to call every complaint from the right a grievance, with the implication that it is unserious, the product of a grudge or a delusion, but to treat the endless train of complaints emanating from the left as wholly justified, legitimate, noble efforts to right outrageous wrongs. Once again, there are many other examples, especially when it comes to writing about Trump and the rise of Trump derangement syndrome, but I won't bore you. In summary, I have presented to you the principal trends and forces that I believe are inimical to free thought and expression, both in the university and in society at large. These trends have led my own university to take action against me, and they help account for the distortions and falsehoods that I am dealing with today. As for what we should do about this, trigger warning. I don't have magical solutions, although I do have thoughts. And I am happy to discuss these vexing challenges further in our question and answer and comment period. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that. So my name is Stefan Serafin. I am, for next 20 or so days, a professor of law at the University of Ottawa, after which, well, we can talk
And then what happened?
Well, anyway. Going back to private practice, most likely. So I have a question. It's kind of touching on the theme that you brought up. Why woke? Why this ideology? And something I've been grappling with lately, and I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on this. Like, the Steelman version of this ideology is that given the fact of pluralism on a scale that has probably never been experienced in Western culture, at least in some past couple hundred years, I think that the Steelman version of this would be something like, well, we need to enforce some kind of rigid dogma that prevents people from tripping over lines and causing offense, because offense can much more easily be taken in a social context where people don't necessarily start with the same priorities whatsoever. Wondering if you have any thoughts on that, and if you've grappled with this yourself.
That's what I call the Singapore solution. We all have to live together in a diverse society, so we have to make nice and be nice to each other. You know, in the United States, I don't know, I think the answer might differ from country to country and culture to culture. I would say in the United States, it's just been not wholly negative. I mean, I'm not going to pretend there aren't upsides and downsides to every issue, because of course there are. But I think the refusal to face reality about group differences, let's say, and how, no, groups are not equal in every respect, either potentially or in actuality, frankly, has had disastrous, divisive, polarizing consequences in our country, and really has eroded some of our main commitments upon which our strength rests. I mean, and this all boils down to having to deal with our Black population. I mean, now it's gotten a lot more complicated because we've got these large infusions of immigrants from all sorts of different cultures and countries, so it's more complicated. But for a long time, we had to deal with the problem, the race problem. And I think there was sincere faith that if conditions were right, then the status of these Black and white would equalize. But that hasn't happened. Right? So now there's this atmosphere of sheer desperation. You know, why hasn't it happened? We have to look around for someone to blame, or something to blame, for a culprit. And that desperate search for a culprit has led to terrible distortions in our society. Now, you know, people like Coleman Hughes, this young Black man, they take the position, well, I'm sorry, we can't introduce people to this idea that Blacks have higher crime rates, they have lower IQ, that there really are differences, we don't know what to do about them, they affect our social life in important ways, they affect the success of Black people in important ways. We can't have people think about things that way. We can't tell them the truth. We can't tell them the truth. They're gonna find out the truth. I mean, they are finding out the truth. That's the thing. My students are going on the internet and finding out the truth. They're asking about it and the like. I guess I would say, as Steve Saylor, the Twitter blogger says, it's not as big a deal as you think. I think we can live with it. We can live with the fact that groups are really not equal in all respects. I don't know about that. There's another philosopher at Cambridge named Nathan Kovnes who says, you know, when we go back to colorblind meritocracy, what's going to happen is there aren't going to be any barely any black physicians, barely any blacks in Silicon Valley. They're not going to be able to, you know, people the high achieving, high IQ demanding sectors of society, and people are going to be shocked. They're not going to accept that. Maybe so, but they're going to have to accept it. I guess that's all I can say about it. It's hard. It's very hard. You either lie, I mean, you're caught between, you know, this devil in the deep blue sea here. You either lie about reality, or you tell the truth, and you bite the bullet on the fact that there's going to be stratification in society by race. And now with immigrant groups, by ethnicity, by, you know, country of origin, by continent of origin. It's just a fact of reality. I don't know which is worse. I mean, maybe people have an opinion about it.
I'll cede the floor. Question after that. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. That was a great talk, as was the former talk that you gave. You mentioned an interesting line, and I just wanted to follow up with this idea of the loyal opposition. I've heard that before. And the idea is that despite the fact that I disagree with you, I still see you as a human being. Now, that at one time was a conceivable notion. I don't know that it is now. And I would point out that when you look at survey data, for example, year after year, those on the left can consider those on the right not people with bad ideas, but bad people. And my question then is there a time when we have to distinguish that the group on the other side of the aisle is actually not the loyal opposition, but instead are actually the enemy? Is there a time when we recognize that the group on the other side wants to harm us? And was that something that was realized just before the American Revolution as well? So maybe sometimes they aren't the loyal opposition. How do we know when that has changed?
Yeah, well, that's an enormous line drawing problem that we've had throughout our history, and there's no easy answer. All right, I think the short answer is we have to do our very best and hesitate before we draw that line and say, no more loyal opposition, you're really the enemy. And the phrase that you use, destroy us, is the place to start. So take communism in the 50s. I always find it risible that, you know, the progressive left dumps on McCarthyism and defends communists. I mean, frankly, there was a lot to be said for McCarthyism. The communists really did want to destroy us. They said that. They said, we want to destroy your way of life. We want to bury you. Like, what about that don't you understand? Okay? That is very different from, we just have a different idea about how to run the railroad. We love the railroad and we want the railroad to run. We love our country in some sense, that, you know, we all belong, we're all citizens, and we just want the best for it by our lights. That is a different attitude. Now, the problem is, and I identified in my talk, the progressive left doesn't think that way anymore. So the question is, how can we call them back to that paradigm, which is absolutely essential? There are groups in our country now, like Better Angels, Heterodox Academy, that are trying to call people back to that paradigm, right? You are our fellow citizen. You are not our enemy. You are our friend, to use Lincoln's words. And we all ultimately are working towards the same goal, which is a better country. We just have very different ideas about what makes for that. And let's face it, what's good for us? I mean, faction is a mixed bag. So, yes, there are groups and people who from the Arab world, from the Muslim world, is a destruction of Western Civ project. And of course the progressives are promoting that project. They're fostering that project. So definitely, you're making a very good point. We have to make a distinction, and it's a difficult one to make. And people even disagree on who's on which side of the line here. There is such a thing as an enemy.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your talk a lot. Now, this is a bit of a difficult area for me to get into in this crowd, but I'm a follower of George Orwell. I consider myself to be a socialist. And I do take issue with, and not just yourself, but a number of people, my friends, not my enemies, my friends, who really, it seems to me, do not really diagnose the current woke phenomenon. And this has to do with, I guess it comes down to the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion project, which I see as being corporate. So it is, you mentioned equality of outcomes as being a major part of this, which I totally agree with, that's equity. Equity is equality of outcomes, but it's not equality of economic outcomes. It's equality of proportionality of groups. So the idea is, and I'm studying Aboriginal, non-Aboriginal relations in Canada, and our equity policies at universities is something like this. 7% of the population in Alberta, which is where I was teaching at Mount Royal until I was pushed out of there as a socialist because I disagreed with how Aboriginal policy was being examined, and argued that it's actually a self-serving group of lawyers and consultants that is leading the marginalized Aboriginal population. But in order for us to have 7% of professors be Aboriginal, you need to not say anything which will upset an Aboriginal scholar activist, because that will mean that they feel unsafe and they will no longer be at the university and go to another university, which means that the person who's making that person feel unsafe has to go so that Aboriginal scholar activists can be rehired. That's the logic of equity, diversity, inclusion. And this is really not about equalizing economic outcomes. It's about making sure that the public face of the corporation has representation amongst it. So I think that's a big part of wokeism, which I don't really see as being a left-wing kind of idea, in the sense of a George Orwell type of approach, which would be concerned about the working class and economic types of having your needs satisfied, all these kinds of things, but it's really about how do you make a corporation look like it's interested in helping people and is not just about its own brand and so on and so forth. So I don't know, I'm wondering whether you had any thoughts on that, and how would you respond to that kind of analysis of equity, diversity, and inclusion kinds of policies?
Well, first of all, every exposition of DEI that I have encountered, both in the university and outside, has included equal economic outcomes as a big priority, right? So constant complaining, blacks have lower home ownership, lower savings, lower incomes, lower job status, lower earnings. Economics is a big part of it. I don't think you can excise that from the equity project. Secondly, the whole idea of wanting proportional representation in any institution is, I think, one of the things that is objected to in the woke catechism. Why? Because it requires abandonment of a lot of values that are compelling, such as being race blind, being meritocratic, enshrining identity as a priority over other priorities. It interferes with the free market, with the maximization of wealth that the free market, and just with the liberty that the free market represents. I mean, we could make a whole list of what is wrong with trying to socialize, trying to engineer equal outcomes on any dimension when it wouldn't naturally occur under the kind of system that we have adopted and built, right? It's oppressive, it's constraining, it's liberty reducing. You know, you have to construct that argument. So even if you leave economics aside, there are other aspects of equity, as you described, proportional representation, that one could have very compelling objections to. And then to turn it around, you know, why do we need proportional representation when it's obvious that different groups, different in their talents, their interests, their competencies, the distribution of their attributes, I mean, this is just right in front of our eyes. Why would we want that outcome? So I'm just, you know, I don't think that you really fully appreciate the full panoply of objections to the equity imperative. It's not just economic, and it is economic. It's both economic, but not just economic. That would be my answer.
If I could just respond a little bit to that. So in terms of the outcomes of proportional representation, so you asked, can we live, like, I'm just trying to paraphrase what you said, whereby can we accept having no black physicians and so on? And my response would be, why is that so difficult? Like, it's not a problem unless we say your value as a human being is whether you're in a high IQ classification type of job. Like, we're not gonna value you unless you're a doctor.
Well, I think we have to emphasize, and I think there are people on the right who do it. If you read chapter 22 of Charles Murray's The Bell Curve, he says precisely this.
Yes.
He says people's moral worth, right, and their worth as human beings does not depend on what job they have, what their socioeconomic status, where they are in the pecking order, and the like. It depends on other things, and we can never forget that. And of course, elites do tend to forget that because they do tend to cash out worth in those terms and the like. I mean, I'm sorry, but, and I think being a doctor is a good example, because there are certain things you have to know, there are certain abilities you have to have. Medicine is more and more demanding, more and more complex and fast moving. And for whatever reason, all right, most blacks in our country are not ready for prime time. They are not ready for that.
And I don't disagree, but I disagree with you. Like, you and I are agreeing.
Well, let's accept that. We
You and I it's more the view that if you're not in this kind of occupation or you don't have this IQ, you're somehow less worthy and not able, and that's not your view, I'm not saying it's your view, it's an elite kind of position in the equity, diversity, and inclusion ideology.
I think it is implicit. I think you're absolutely right.
And we have to argue against that. It's being a physician, you should be a physician because you're going to be the best person to be able to be that physician. And we shouldn't think lesser of people who aren't able to be physicians. Like, that's not it. People contribute to society in all sorts of ways, and we shouldn't have a prescriptive view about you're a better person or a worse person because of the kind of occupation that you occupy. And that's the kind of mentality, I think, which is leading to this blockage in terms of people thinking through this on the basis of a merit-based approach as opposed to an identity-based approach.
Okay, you won't get an argument from me, but I think what's gone on, and the reason that progressives have shot themselves in the foot, and they now feel impelled to get equal outcomes and everything, is because they have systematically denigrated and downgraded the other sources of honor and esteem in our society, right? Which is the bourgeois virtues, obeying the law, being honest, being frugal, working hard, working to the best of your ability, whatever ability God endowed you with, supporting your family, sticking with your obligations, obeying the rules. I wrote an op-ed lauding those virtues, and I was immediately condemned by 50% of my faculty. So when you have that attitude, that your notion of virtue and what a good person is has just gone up in smoke, so we would never hold someone's rap sheet against them, right? That sort of attitude. What else have you got? What are the sources of esteem in our society? What do we admire?
Thank you very much. We agree on that.
Just to comment further on this proportionality business, you just look at sports and the Olympic Games. Nobody complains that blacks are overwhelmingly very high performers and very high earners in all of the sports-related businesses. Now, I have never heard anyone argue that there are too many blacks in football or whatever sport. Really, I know nothing about sports. So, they just never argue that. I used to hear a different argument all the time about the feminism business. There has never been a female president of the United States. True. But 99.99999% of the males have never been president of the United States either. It's just, in a way, it's a ridiculous argument. The whole thing is ridiculous. And there can never be proportionality in that sense. I mean, I used to do all these kinds of statistics about so many women here and men there and all the rest of it. And you had, for example, two professions in which very large professions, in which female dominated, teaching and nursing. And there's a very large proportion of female professionals who are in those two professions. So let's say that you've got 50-50, 50% men, 50% women roughly. So you take away the proportion of women who are already nurses and teachers, and what does that leave you with to be all the other things that they're supposed to be proportionate with the men, the engineers and so on? Not many. The numbers just don't work out. Unless you argue that we are going to force men to become nurses and men to become elementary school teachers, you can't argue that we haven't got enough female engineers or whatever it is, you haven't got enough.
Well, of course you're right. Of course you're right. And, I have never, the mainstream media is the gatekeeper of all of these things. They won't allow anything like your subversive thoughts to show up on their pages. But you have to understand that, you know, the progressive elites who have outsized influence in our society, for sure, they have this weird sort of pecking order universe in which certain prestigious jobs are, you know, get outsized focus and attention, and disadvantaged groups, we have to increase their representation there. And then there are other jobs like teaching and nursing, which have been considered historical ghettos. They're much less prestigious. They earn less, blah, blah, blah. So nobody cares about masculinizing those professions. I mean, there's a whole kind of weird worldview here that's operating, full of inconsistencies and paradoxes and et cetera. So I'm not, you know, I can only describe it. I can't really explain it, or I certainly am not going to justify it.
We're going to have a merch table from t-shirts that say, "I agreed with Amy Wax." Just as a sidebar to this
No, we
conversation.
never say, "as we all agree." We have friends that my husband refuses to see again who say, "as we all agree." Do not say that.
There's a study of the Northern European countries that look at as those societies become more and more gender inclusive, you get increased sex segregation across different professions. I wanted to go in a different direction and maybe talk about philosophy, because I see this theme. So Charles Sanders Peirce was all about fallibilism, right? And I see this reflecting through three different parts of your talk. Woke, when you see these people operating, do not admit fallibility. They know the truth, and they are going to bring it about. I see utopia. Yeah, we have this tremendous political inequality at the university with almost no conservatives. There's no instinct to bring a devil's advocate position and have a conservative or right-wing voice given this inequality, because there's no chance of fallibility. I wonder if this is a theme. And then we have more and more women in administration of the universities, which I think has precipitated this safety culture. And, you know, we all know that males are toxic, but do females admit to any fallibility? Do I dare? No. Oh, there's the answer. Thank you.
Well, do they admit to any toxicity? And they've got plenty of it. Okay.
Oh, this is perfect. That was a perfect segue for what I'm going to say. Yeah, I was interested in the role of feminism as we take a look at what we've lost in the women's movement, what we hoped to gain in the women's movement, and then what we actually have. And we have actually, like, we don't even have the word woman anymore. So we've lost the word woman. And we've lost so much. But actually, I want to move on to something. I want to make a point about, I worked before I got booted out. I worked with immigrants all the time. And so I want to kind of like make a comment about the problem of when someone has a past, and we even touched on that earlier, the Indigenous background, when they come through family situations or wars or alcohol, abusive homes, all that stuff, the ability of any human being to rise after that, it becomes diminished. Although there's so many things that can support and help with that. But I think in our culture, we don't like, the current culture does not like the answers that actually would solve the problem. And if you look back, I had to look it up. I knew there was a professor, a black professor in Harvard who got pushed out, but his name was Roland Fryer. I had to look that name up. And I think, if I recall, I might be wrong, Claudine Gay from you remember her, what actually was instrumental in Bushmill. I'm not quite sure, am I right about that? Okay. So when you think that he identified the problem and was helping Black kids really progress, and he himself had gone from one of those horrible family environments to become a professor, legitimately, like not a DEI hire, and was making huge progress, and was actually trying to solve that problem like a good guy. And they didn't like the results, like they didn't like the philosophy behind what he believed to be the problem. And it was like the family structure is a problem when you're trying to move kids forward, like the environment. And so the aspirational goal of two people raising a kid and trying to create a home that's that nurtures and develops and is secure and safe. The feminists or the DEI people, they don't like that. They don't want the answer to be the aspirational goal of monogamy, because that goes against so many things about the sexual freedom movement. And so I think that I'm going to say something like maybe a bit unpopular in our culture, that like the sexual mess that we're in right now is causing a lot of chaos for kids. And so when you think about aspirational goals and trying to have families raise kids and do well, that the sexual morality, I'm going to say that horrible word morality, of how you're living your life actually really matters. But I don't think that we're going to be able to fix this, because no one likes that answer or that solution, and it's never going to be popular. But like that was enough. I'll just stop there.
Yeah, I think that, there are several far left priorities, third rails that you touched on. One is they don't want to celebrate the traditional family because that is considered constraining and patriarchal. They are also hostile to the idea of self-help. Everybody is a victim of their surrounding ambient circumstances. And that, the notion that you can engage in self-improvement goes against that, especially when you grow up in adverse circumstances. So that becomes a kind of excuse machine. And the third priority this touches on is, of course, sexual liberation. The notion that the apogee of our expressive individualism is for us to engage in sexual practices as we will, and that is the core and the key to self-improvement and self-expression. And so when you bring all of those priorities together, you get hostility to Roland Fryer saying everybody needs a stable family, children need to grow up in a stable family, and adults need to constrain themselves and restrain themselves to provide that. That is their duty. And once again, it's bad for women, it's bad for children. Actually, it's turning out to be bad for men too, oddly enough, what we've done in that realm. But I don't know how to unwind it, except to hear from people like Roland Fryer, from this guy Rob Henderson, who grew up as a foster child, and says, I went to Yale and I saw people tearing down marriage and conventional families, but they all came from conventional families. Funny thing about that. So, we need moral entrepreneurs to counter the narrative.
Thanks, Amy. I wonder if I can revisit Dave's question earlier about loyal opposition versus identifying the enemy, and push you a little bit on the lines that you might want to draw. You mentioned drawing lines. And my impression is that you actually give the impression of being remarkably tolerant and respectful of those people who others might identify as their enemy, especially given your own experience.
Sure.
and extending to them a kind of respect that they are not extending to you. And so the general question would be, you know, when would you draw the line and say, well, that, you know, that person has crossed the line and actually, not to the extent of trying to censor them and not allowing them to say what they think. That's not the right tool, I think, to use, but to treat them, at least in the back of your head, as somebody who is not to be trusted and to be categorized in the enemy camp because they are after you and me and us. And in that context, if I had a part two, given that context and given your experience, if you were to advise somebody now who was coming out of graduate school and wanted to be an academic and had the same kind of views that you hold, how would you advise them to wind their way through the enemy field that you see in front of them?
Okay, well, the latter is kind of a little bit distinct, so let me go back to what makes someone a friend, when do they cross over the line to enemy, and how do you tell? First of all, I acknowledge that we're swimming in a world of asymmetry, okay? I mean, I am treated as the enemy, full stop.
Right.
And I will destroy you. They will destroy me, right? They will penalize me, they will, you know, suspend me, they will cut my salary. I mean, they've done all of that. So that's definitely in the camp of stuff you do to kneecap your enemy. Right? So how can you treat someone as a friend if someone treats you that way? I think you can, up to a point. But that leads me to the second aspect, which is, there is a wonderful word, frenemy. So what does the word frenemy mean? It means that in most situations, someone is not all friend and all enemy, right? They're kind of a mixed bag. And there are a lot of different things different ways that you can treat someone who disagrees with you, you know, doesn't see eye to eye with you, depending on the circumstances and on what they choose to do to you. Given what Penn has done to me, I am now suing them. I mean, I don't know, is a lawsuit an enemy thing, a friend thing? I mean, what is it? You know, Miss James Stevens says, if you go up against the zeitgeist of the age, bring a sword. Bring one, be prepared to use it. I don't think he means use it every time. Said, arm yourself. And I tell students, if it's a culture war, you know, there's a reason they call it a war, because people get hurt. But all I would really say is, strive to achieve the principle of charity, which is Lincoln's. We are fellow citizens. We must be friends. To the extent that we can be friends, we must be. And, you know, at a point it will break. We will break through to enemy. But let's just widen that territory as much as we can, and see what happens. As for, you know, what should you tell a young academic? Well, you know, my son just got his PhD in economics, and he has a number of friends from college who are getting their PhDs. A couple of them are entering academia. They're all conservatives. And he has decided for now not to, because he said, Mom, it's a hostile environment. You know, for a white conservative Jewish guy, it's a hostile environment. People have to live their lives, you know. Or do you want to take that on? I actually think there's sort of I haven't said that to him, but there's sort of a duty to take that on in a way. I mean, I am in a very different situation than a young person. I am in the best possible position to stay inside the belly of the beast and fight. But, you know, for other people, it's very costly. For young people, it's very, very, you know, how can you suppress your views for 10 years? No, now I have tenure. Now I can say what I really want. Well, I have tenure. I said what I really I mean, it may have given the pause to fire me. I think they might have blinked on that one, because I know people wanted to. But they did render a very severe penalty on me that costs, you know, a lot of money, my family a lot of money. And of course, they treat me like a total pariah. I mean, you know, people cutting me and not speaking to me. It's like I'm invisible and I don't exist. I mean, that for a lot of people, and I'm pretty tough, but for a lot of people, that would be extremely traumatizing and hurtful. So I guess the answer is it depends.
I'm Ron Thompson. So I wanted to take up a point that you made that I thought was interesting about feminization having something to do connected to increasing dishonesty.
Yeah.
And I'm not 100% convinced by that argument. I've never thought about it in those terms, because I've kind of thought that the DEI enterprise has essentially primarily benefited white women. And so there is a disproportionate number of white women in leadership. So now dishonesty is being attributed to them because there happens to be more of them, and that's certainly been my experience. But I would actually argue that it's more of a Machiavellian thing, where people have lost a sense of morality. So in my workplace, the strike against me when they talk about that guy, Ron Thompson, is that my problem is that I have a moral compass. And that's expressed by many people, that my problem is that I have a small compass. And so when I hear you talk and you allude and you use the term morality, I'm wondering if this has more to do with the loss of the moral compass by society, because if you think about Tom Holland's book, Dominion, that Christendom, for good or bad, remade the world. And it remade the world with a certain set of values. And that those values no longer exist, and that we're really just running on fumes. And you have people like Richard Dawkins who's saying, I'm a cultural Christian, because there's a recognition that we've lost that. And some people want it back, but some of the people like Richard Dawkins who want it back are the very people that tried to undermine it. So I'm wondering if you think that there's any hope of going back to something where we're running on fumes, it's really a religious enterprise based on morality.
Well, I mean, you know, to the extent that you're saying that honesty as an imperative commitment, a value, intellectual honesty as well as personal honesty, they're both kind of in decline and on the skids for all very broad reasons, you know, sort of secular, cultural reasons. I agree with you. So you know, it's not just academic women who are indulging in this kind of flouting of the truth in service of these important goals that they identify as more important and virtuous. Because other people are doing it too. And a lot of people are just doing it because they want to get ahead, and you know, they're advancing their own interests. You know, they're all the usual reasons. So I agree with you. All I'm really saying is, and a lot of this is just coming out of my own experience of dealing with Penn for 7 years, and you know, the fact that they've been bringing charges against me and trying to complain about me is, it is overwhelmingly women in the administration, in the student body, in the professoriate, who have prosecuted a lot of these accusations against me, and I have been struck by their willingness to say things that are just not true. You know, I mean, that's the only way I can put it. I sometimes doubt my own sanity, you know, because they're saying things that I know are false. Does one swan a summer make? I mean, maybe it just happens to be my university, my case, my moment. But I don't think so, because the window dressing that goes around that is a lot of rhetoric and a lot of dogma and ideology about how honesty, the bourgeois virtues, and seeking truth and speaking your mind and honest inquiry, evidence-based reporting, all of that, that's just this patriarchal Western plot to keep people down. That is part of the woke rhetoric that you do hear, right? It's just a cover for power politics, for exertions of power and the maintenance of privilege. So there is an ideology behind it. And women are all in for that ideology. It's not that men aren't. But women are, they're in the forefront. They're in the forefront of DEI, for sure.
Maybe for the people with whom whom one disagrees with, to be considered loyal opposition, or for yourself to consider yourself the loyal opposition, there needs to be something like a common endeavor or a common project. So if me and the person with whom I disagree are both committed, say, to the project of parliamentary democracy, to the endeavor of parliamentary democracy, then however great our differences are, there's still that endeavor that we both serve. Or maybe in academia, thinking hard about difficult matters and trying to get them straight. So you can see people like Keynes and Hayek, for instance, both committed to that same endeavor, understanding economic activity, and so in that sense they don't become enemies. But if that's lacking, I don't think it means that one is going to take the other as an enemy. But something like common citizenship or common humanity, whatever, just seems too thin to hang. I mean, it's not an endeavor, it's not a project, it's a status. I think that, if we don't have something thicker than that, then the idea of loyal opposition is difficult to sustain, to see the other as such.
Yeah, this is a great comment, and I think it's very thought-provoking. How thick does the commonality have to be? What are the elements and the components that you have to be both committed to, mutually committed to? Well, I mean, these are difficult questions that I don't think you can easily generalize about. They have to take it in a way case by case, right? It depends on what your common endeavor is. I mean, take citizenship. I think this is one reason why I think it's unwise to dump on nationalism and the importance of nationality, and even sort of ethno-nationality, like being French or whatever, because these have been fertile sources of common endeavor and that have bound people together for a purpose, and they would differ onto how to play out that purpose. So when Lincoln says, he talks explicitly in the second inaugural about your fellow citizens. We are Americans. We have just fought a bloody war to keep the nation as one, as united, and that is an imperative priority for us. So you need to take your citizenship really seriously, and that as a binding element that pulls you together. So I would disagree that citizenship is too thin. In the university, I mean, my fellow faculty, with whom I agree on very little, they see themselves as the champions of the university, of properly educating the young, of the educational endeavor that they're engaged in. we are both trying to maintain and preserve and protect and champion the university. I have to believe that that's true. We have wildly different ideas about how it's best done. So that has to suffice. But once again, I don't think you can generalize. I think you have to go case by case and decide when it's too thin and when you've just lost whatever ties that bind, and now you're in a war, all-out war.
Thanks, Amy. Oh, another interesting talk. I'm struck by your comment about feminization, because I've had these thoughts myself of our institutions. Just a little backgrounder. About 7 years ago, Bruce and I were involved in a pushback effort against our legal regulator that was imposing a compelled statement of principles to promote DEI. So I was sort of the one who got all the hate mail and went through all of that. And we also put up a website and had people sign up to show support for this pushback effort. We were ultimately successful, as it turned out, at least on that small point. But I couldn't help but notice the gender differences in the responses. So, for example, it was almost all males who signed up to be in favor of freedom of expression, of individual rights, of not being compelled to say something against your views. And it was almost all women who sent vicious emails saying, because we were challenging this equity notion. And to steelman that, I was thinking, maybe there's just something fundamentally hardwired into us. It goes back to our days of living in tribes where the men would go off to the hunt and they bring back the meat, and the women would have to ensure that they didn't just keep it for themselves, that we all got to eat, that everybody I think there may be some biological reason for this, but what I worry about is, women have made great strides. We do get to be equals and do the jobs that men do, for good and bad. Sometimes I think maybe many of us would wish we didn't have to now. But so my question is, have you given thought to how we help our sisters tame some of that, instinct or whatever it is that's overly feminizing our institutions, so that we aren't dealing with a backlash to come, which puts us literally back in, the kitchen. Which, by the way, I like the kitchen just fine. I want to have a choice, right? So anyway, I just want to talk about that.
Good question. I think, in my mind, from what I've learned and read, undeniably, there is a biopsychological basis to these gender differences, these sex differences. Evolved. If you learn evolutionary biology and psychology, you can't help but think that. But I would say their tendencies, women classically befriend and tend, and men go out and, hunt, engage in hierarchical competition and all of this. These are the cliches, but I think they're very, very valid. But here's what I would say. This is so interesting. Civilization is put on earth to restrain our inherited biological innate tendencies. Right? Without doing that, we cannot live together in advanced societies. That is what morality is for, that is what civilized norms are for. And we talk endlessly about how we have to curb male tendencies. Is there a more destructive force on earth than, male competition and male sexuality? No, of course not. Well, we can't let it run riot. We have a million rules to constrain that and to channel it into constructive avenues. But we don't talk much about how women's tendencies have to be channeled and curbed and, tamed. And I think this is one of the tendencies of women that really needs to be constrained, especially if they are going to enter into previously male institutions, which men have crafted and generated and created over generations, to the point that they are very successful and Chesterton's Benz, right? And so my attitude would be, you all, girls can come in and participate, a little bit like immigration actually, come in and you can be part of academia, because we know that, you know, some of you are smart, some of you are very capable, we fully acknowledge that. But you know what? You can't change the rules. I'm sorry, we're gonna draw the line, right? The rules that we've established for, you know, rigor, argumentation, debate, and then we have a beer, we don't adduce offense, we don't have a heckler veto, we pursue the truth even if it's untoward or hurtful, all of that, we grow knowledge, we just make a list of how we think these institutions will function. They're gonna continue to function that way. And frankly, I'm disappointed, and I've spoken about this before, and I've gotten a lot of mail about it, that men Well, Richard Hanania says we don't like seeing women's tears. That causes us to dissolve.
As a father of 2 daughters, it's true.
Yes.
So it's a great discussion, and there's been a lot of like metaphors and analogies, and we're talking about loyal opposition, and if you're going into battle, you have to have your sword, and all these sorts of things, and you've been in the trenches, right? I am not a clever man. When somebody confronts me, I've read The Art of War 1,000 times, I'm never clever about it. So we've all been in conflict, not all of us, but I'm suspecting the majority of the people in this room have had conflict over these issues of people that we disagree with. The tools and weapons that we've always used have always been, we're going to construct cogent arguments. Some reasons are better than others. My experience in the conflicts I've had is that those rules of engagement are no longer valid, right? And so...
They're rigged.
Yeah, and so my question to you is, in your experience, have you come up with any other clever ways of fighting this other than maintaining truth and doggedly pursuing cogent arguments, reason and rationality? Are there, you know, should we start heckling, right? I don't know what I'm looking for. Have you come up with any new strategies, or is that just, that's what we're going to do, is put our heads down and keep pushing forward with what we know has worked in the past and resulted in positive outcomes?
Well, I mean, there is the, you know, Bruce Party strategy of, you know, move fast and break things, burn it all down. I mean, I'm not necessarily averse to that in certain contexts. I'm very skeptical that the academy can reform itself, even under pressure. We will see, because the drama is playing out in the United States right now. If you stay inside, though, which I've chosen to do, you can challenge some of those rules of how things are sorted out. So I'll give you a concrete example, right? I lodged a complaint about my current dean, not the one who brought charges against me, but there's a new one, and she's even worse, right? Because she tried to, it sounds trivial, but I had a visiting speaker that was not approved by the powers that be. And the dean just sent me this abrupt email and said, I'm moving your class outside the law school to a local hotel, and you have to arrange for security, or I won't even let you hold it there, right? And so I lodged a formal complaint with our Committee on Academic Freedom and Responsibility. And long story short, you know, after weeks and weeks and weeks, and they issued a report which I thought was a whitewash and, you know, elided so much of the truth. Well, you know, what else is new? But it's strewn with confidential. So I said to the head of the committee, why is this confidential? Like, cite me the legal source that requires this to be confidential. I still haven't gotten a straight answer. I said, the students in my class that she moved, they want to know what happened. I want to send them this report. I want to follow up with them. I said, I thought this school was created to serve the students, not the faculty and the administration, which is something that we forget, right? Because we're always covering our ass. So that's a small, trivial example. Like, I'm challenging the whole confidentiality thing because I think it's just a cover. It's a way to evade accountability and responsibility. It's certainly not there to protect me. When they were negotiating with me over my penalty, they wanted me to sign a non-disparagement clause. Do you know what that means? That means you can't talk at all about anything that they did to you, any charges they brought, anything about the proceedings, nothing. Omerta, silence. All right, well, this is a free speech case. I said, hell will freeze over before I sign this. I said that publicly. Well, they were not happy. They cut off negotiations immediately. So, yeah, look at the rules and ask yourself, why are these rules here? Whose interest do they serve? Justify them.
Sorry, I know I'm taking my second position here, which is probably dominating things, but I've heard you speak on this, and I think you might have something to say about this, on the question of feminization, which I thought was very helpful, which is the agreeableness trait.
Which I don't have.
So, and I don't have it. I used to have it, but I don't have it anymore. I've learned not to have it, because if you have it, it is just toxic. It's toxic. And I think what happens is that...
Well, you can't fight.
Yes.
You can't
and then you get angry and vindictive and bitter when you feel that it's been... And I think it's a bit of the dynamic about agreeableness that might be at work with respect to the feminization.
Yeah. No, women do tend to mean the big five personality traits. This is social science, so or psychology. So take it with a grain of salt, but it's pretty well established, I think, and I'm convinced of it, that the big five personality traits do differ by gender, and one of the big differences is in agreeableness. Women tend to be more agreeable than men in the sense that they are less willing to contradict others, upset others, challenge others. That's what it means to be agreeable. And that trait can be, you know, a positive thing in certain settings. It's probably good maybe in certain family situations where women are the ones that are trying to smooth things over and keep things going and all of that. These kind of small bore situations that women have generally been in charge of. And they might even be useful in bigger organizations, you know, where everybody's trying to get along, but it's a matter of degree. And too much agreeableness can be, as you say, pathological, because people try and prey on your agreeableness. You're a bitch. You're a racist, you're awful, I mean, they'll say a lot of negative things about you, and they'll keep saying them, and it's easy to, you know, get worn down by that. It is very, very easy. That's normal, that's the way people are. They like other people to like them, they want other people to like them.